All right. So I think most of you know now that we're in the part of our church year that we call the Jesus season, which is between Christmas and Easter, which are the bookend events of Jesus' life. So we spend those months focused only on Jesus. And one of the things we do as a church family is we read through a gospel together every year. This year it's Matthew. Makes it easy on me this year because what I'm doing for you is I preach on something on Sunday morning that you will then read about the subsequent week. And that's what I'm going to do today for you as you prepare to read through Matthew 10 and 11. Let me pick up for you kind of the plot flow or storyline in the Gospel of Matthew that you've seen so far or heard me talk about so far or even read for yourself so far. In the first chapter of Matthew's Gospel that's devoted to Jesus' adult life and ministry, these should be familiar to you now. You know that his fame was spreading like wildfire all across the Middle East at the time. And it did so for two primary reasons. He was teaching, and he was working supernatural wonders or works. Here's how the first few chapters of Jesus' adult ministry in Matthew's gospel flow or fit together. We're told that late in Matthew chapter 4, and then immediately after, you're given an example, maybe the best example in your Bible, of his teaching that was gaining him such notoriety, namely the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. And then you get two chapters that you read last week full of examples, 12 to be exact, of these wonderful, miraculous things that he was doing for the marginalized and the desperately needy. Extraordinary stories. But then you come to Matthew chapter 10, and apparently all that was not enough. The message and work of Jesus was not spreading fast enough, and so something else became necessary. And here is what happens next. Jesus, the famous teacher and wonder worker, decides to, in the early part of Matthew chapter 10, send out his followers to do exactly what he himself has been doing. To teach the things that they had been taught, to do the things that they had seen Jesus be doing. He sent out his followers to do his work in his way on his behalf. Now, if that concept at all rings a bell for you, that's because last year, when we were reading through the Gospel of Luke together, we spent about 6 weeks in a series called the 70 Strategy, talking about this very same passage in the Gospel of Luke. And in that case, it's not 12 disciples we're told who were sent out. We're told it's 70 or 72 who were sent out to do Jesus' work. There are, in fact, on your chairs today, summary cards that we drew up of that series, so you can see what all is entailed. There's also a resource pack from that series on the back table if you'd like it. And I'll repost the messages from that series online this week if that would be helpful for you. But we've talked about this before. The idea that those of us who are followers of Jesus have been commissioned to go out and to teach like he taught, to do what he did on his behalf. Now let's dig down a little deeper, though, into Matthew chapter 10. And this sending out of his followers to do his work. Because I think we want to pay attention to the things that Jesus himself, in sending them out, decided to pay attention to. Note for me, first, that early in Matthew chapter 11, we are told that Jesus at some point finished instructing his disciples about going out and then moved on to do other things. What that tells me, as a careful reader of Scripture, you would pick up on this too, is that all of Matthew chapter 10 is one sitting. Jesus sat down and in one shot gave his followers a one-day training seminar on what to do as they went out to be ministers like him, for him, to other people. So when you read Matthew chapter 10, you have to read it knowing this was Jesus' training seminar for his followers to go do his work among the people in the world. I also note that Jesus and his followers and the people to whom they've sent shared a lot in common. They shared culture in common, they shared ethnicity in common, they shared religion in common. They shared a belief in the Old Testament and the Bible in common. They shared a belief in God in common. They shared a common morality. This should go well. Jesus should be teaching people who should have ears to hear. This should go well. When he sends out his disciples and they do his work in his name, people should listen and be drawn to it. This should go well. This is not cross-cultural ministry that's going on here in Matthew 10. This is talking to people just like you. I also note this when I read through Matthew chapter 10 about the sending of the disciples to go do Jesus' work because Jesus simply couldn't do enough of the work himself. There are 37 verses in that chapter, and 25 of them are on the same subject, which means 2/3 of the chapter are about one thing, which makes you think, whatever that one thing is, Jesus thought it was the most important thing that he could prepare his disciples to experience or do. Now, that's where you need to pause and think to yourself, okay, so Jesus is going to send his followers, like me, common, ordinary people, who are good at some things and poor at others in their Christian experience. They get some things and don't get others. I wonder what Jesus thought the single most important thing was for people like me to know as we go out and try to be his voice and his hands and his heart to the world around us. What do we need to know as we speak for him, as we pass on what he's taught to us, as we appeal to God to intervene in lives the way that we see Jesus doing in the midst of broken lives? I wonder, what do you think it might be? What's the one thing? Well, this might surprise you. In 25 of the 37 verses in Matthew chapter 10, when he prepares people like us to go out and do his work in the world, this is the focus. The hostility and resistance that you will experience when you go do it. Really. 2/3 of what Jesus passed on to his followers was about that. Talk about a buzzkill. If you're Jesus' followers, you are amped. You have never in your life experienced anything spiritually like you have through Jesus. You've never heard things in your life like Jesus has said. You've never seen things like you've seen Jesus do. You are on the ultimate mountaintop spiritual high. It's like summer camp for high schoolers year-round. And then he tells you, hey, by the way, when you go out to pass on what I've told you, when you go out to influence people, when you go out to intervene in lives the way that I have, when you go out to heal the broken the way that I have, here's what I really need you to remember. Most people aren't going to like it. And in fact, you're going to be rebuffed. You are going to be aggressively prosecuted. You are going to be pushed away. People are going to be defensive. You're going to pay a price for being my follower, trying to do what I've done and say what I say. This would have been a shock to his followers. They were not prepared to be told what he tells them in Matthew chapter 10. This, by the way, to me, begs a very clear and fundamental question. And it is the one, as I read through Matthew chapter 10 and 11, that came to mind for me, and it has to come to mind for you. And it's what I want to talk about today. If Jesus, who is this great and good man, who taught great and good things, and did great and good things for people, is who we think he is, why on earth do people respond to him the way he said they would? Why? I don't get it. And therefore, by extension, if we as his followers go into the world to speak to others what we have learned from him, and to do for others what he has done for us, why will we be met with the same resistance that he was? I don't get it. How could somebody so good be responded to so poorly? Why? Does Jesus tell his followers in Matthew chapter 10 why this is going to happen? What insight does he offer? Well, he does. And I'm going to focus on two this morning. Here are two reasons why Jesus said all who are his followers and try to do his work in the world and speak his truth to others in the world will be met with hostility and opposition. Number one, you can find in verse 25 of Matthew chapter 10. And Jesus tells his followers that they need to expect that people will say of him and therefore of them, quote, if they have called the master of the house, by which he means himself, the devil, how much more will they malign you of my household in the same way? By the way, this is not the only time in the Gospels that Jesus says something like this. He says it in Matthew 12, chapter 26, or verse 26, and on down the line. Now, the first thing you need to catch there is how unbelievably audacious this is. Right? This is almost surreal. How is it exactly that somebody would come to the place that they would look at Jesus, what he said, what he did, what he taught, and they would ascribe to Jesus that he is doing it in the power of or like the devil himself? You want to talk about a not getting it. How does that happen? I understand you may not like Jesus, but saying that he's Satan is like 10 miles more than not liking Jesus. How does that happen? Yet Jesus said it would. And in fact, the religious leaders of Jesus' day on several occasions did this to Jesus' own face. They said, you are doing what you do, you are saying what you say, because you, Jesus, are of the devil. Wow. Why? I don't understand. Well, this tells me something. And it should tell you something. Number one, people can get flat out crazy when you challenge their most basic, beloved, unquestioned beliefs and values. That's part of what you should hear when you hear this instruction from Jesus. People just get irrational when things that they believe or don't question about their life are pulled into a place where now they do have to wonder about it. This, of course, is what Jesus would do. Jesus has already done it, for instance, in the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew. It's already happened before now. He tells them things like, you've heard it said that you should love your friends and you should hate your enemies. But I tell you, you should love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Now, for anyone who takes that seriously, as Jesus teaches that to them, or as the followers of Jesus go out and teach this to other people or pass it along over coffee or dinner to other people, what's going to happen if they take it seriously at all is they're going to have to begin to question how it is that they themselves have lived up to that point in their life. Because what comes natural to human beings is to do exactly what Jesus said, to love the people who are your friends, who treat you well, and to not love the people who don't. To love the people who speak well of you and to not love the people who don't speak well of you or ignore you or speak behind your back. This is human nature. And when you hear that there is a better way, even if it is a better way, it challenges you. It exposes something in you, and you don't like it initially. And so people get flat out crazy. Have you ever seen this happen yourself? I have. I was teaching one time in church on the notion, actually Jesus' notion, of forgiving other people. That we should forgive other people. Here's the quote from the Lord's Prayer that you prayed earlier with me. We should forgive other people the way that God himself forgives us. And so I wondered aloud in that message for my church at the time, wow, I wonder if that means that if we are not willing to forgive other people much, that we don't experience forgiveness from God very much. I wonder if that's why people who are not very forgiving toward others don't have a very gracious and merciful view of God. And things like that. And after the service, somebody came up and said to me, I don't really like what you said today. I want you to know I don't think that's how God works. I don't think you interpreted that passage right. To which at the time I wish I had the wisdom to say, your problem is not with me. Your problem is with Jesus. You can wrestle with that passage the same way I do. I have a hard time living it out the same way you do. The problem, though, is with Jesus. He's the guy who said to us, you will experience forgiveness from God to the degree you are willing to forgive other people. And that person that day would have punched me if they could have, if we weren't in the middle of church. That's how mad at me they were. They were irrational. They were crazy. They were so mad that I would have the audacity to say something that Jesus himself said and would expect them to follow suit. All of us at some point understand this. All of us have heard from Jesus on occasion things that we think, how on earth am I supposed to do that? How am I supposed to change my life to be more like what you've said? We understand that our first instinct is often to be defensive, to rationalize, to say, oh no, that's for somebody else. Or, maybe I'm not doing that, but I am doing this instead. So we're good. We want to mute Jesus' voice every bit as much as other people do. Jesus understood that. And he understood that people can get completely unnerved, completely unspooled when they are confronted with a voice that tells them, maybe you're not doing everything 100% right. Maybe some of the things that you believe the most in life, you need to question. This is what was going to happen to Jesus' disciples as they went out into the world with what Jesus had taught them, passing it on to other people. But see, that shows you that there is something more fundamental going on. If people really would look Jesus straight in the face or his followers and say, Jesus, I don't know what you're about, but you seem like the devil to me. What you're saying to me seems evil and wrong. And there is no part of me that likes what you're saying. Then you need to understand something about the world in which you live, the world which is not that much different today than it was back then. And it is that you and I live in a world that sometimes calls bad good and calls good bad. It is an upside-down world morally and spiritually. This is how Isaiah the prophet, 600 years before Jesus, said that, speaking to God's people Israel in the Old Testament. Isaiah chapter 5, verses 20 to 21. He says, woe to you who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness in place of light and light in place of darkness, who put bitter in place of sweet and sweet in place of bitter. Woe to you who are wise in your own eyes and shrewd in your own sight. We live in a world that tends to get things wrong morally. Not just wrong, but completely opposite. I want you to think about your last week. And I want you to think to yourself, okay, in what I've experienced at work, what I've viewed on television, what I've seen on the internet, in conversations I've had with my friends, where have I seen this be true? Where have I seen my Christian values demeaned or marginalized, even laughed out of the room? And where have I seen things that are counter my Christian values celebrated and championed? Where have you seen it? I have. In the morning, typically, when I get my kids up for school and put them on the bus, I watch cable news. And one of the cable news programs that I watch, I've decided to stop watching. Because I realized in the last few weeks that the only reason those people are on the air is because they like the sound of their own voice. And there is nothing wise about them. There's nothing particularly insightful about them other than they love to flap their gums in front of a camera. And somebody's willing to pay them millions of dollars to do it. And I'm tired of it. Just because they're on TV and famous does not make them smart. You know what? Jesus said that. He said the blessed people of the world are the humble and the overlooked. He said the wisest people in the world, the first people in the world, are the people who serve all. I reflected on that news program that I watch about the people they often have on. And usually the people they have on are the people who are the most successful at what they do. The people who sell the most books, the most music. The people who have the most successful businesses. And I think to myself, that is not indicative of that person's character. Just because that person is monetarily successful does not mean they are a person that I should emulate. They are not a person that our culture should hold up as someone who is an example to be followed by all. In fact, I repeat again, Jesus said the people who in the kingdom are going to be first are the people who seek to serve the most. They're oftentimes the people who go under the radar, unseen, doing for people in ways that we never pay attention to. And I'm tired of it. What about you? How have you seen our culture say bad is good and good is bad? Who are the people who are the most famous in our culture? You think they're the people with the best character? I don't. Why are the people in our culture who are the most famous the most famous? What does that tell you about us? That the people who get Googled the most are famous athletes or movie stars who have the money to do plastic surgery and Botox until they're 70 because they live with the illusion that they need to look like they're 25 when they're getting Social Security. Why? What kind of twisted place do we live in? That these are the values of the culture in which we live and nobody thinks to question it. Why? You see it? This is how Jesus said it in John chapter 3. This is part of how he explained why it is that people would look him in the eye and call him the devil himself because of what he would say to them and do among them. These are the words of John chapter 3, verses 19 to 21. Jesus speaking said, "And this is God's indictment of the world, that light has come into the world, and people love darkness rather than the light, because their own deeds were evil. For all who do evil hate the light and do not come to the light, because they do not want their deeds exposed. But those who do what is true come to the light, so they may prove and be clearly seen to have done their works in God." Did you catch it? The reason that the world and the people around you, as you try to live your Christian life and be an influence for the sake of Jesus upon them, will not like you sometimes, will not like what you stand for or what you say, is because they don't like the way that it exposes what they do, who they are, what they value, and what their priorities are. The word that Jesus uses in John chapter 3 is they don't want that exposed. People apparently would much rather prefer to live in the delusion that they can be happy and have a meaningful life, pursuing things the way that they want according to the twisted morality of our time and culture. And they don't get it, that in order to have that kind of life, a life filled with love and peace and purpose, you have to be willing to make some deep and fundamental changes. You have to be willing to heed the voice of Jesus. And they don't like seeing that. And that's why sometimes they're going to look you in the eye and tell you, you're wrong. You're stupid. What on earth are you doing trying to live a forgiving life? A life of simplicity. A life of quiet dignity. Where you seek to serve in ways that nobody else will see. Where you care for your neighbors who are overlooked and nobody else cares for. They're going to look at you and say, that's a wasted life. And Jesus would say to you, I'm telling you to expect that. Here's the other thing, by the way, that Jesus touches on that I want to call your attention to. This is how he says we should expect that we will oftentimes find ourselves opposed. We will oftentimes be reacted to poorly as Jesus followers, saying what he says, living as he told us to live in the world, trying to do or be on mission with him among those around us. He, by the way, he touches on this particular subject twice at length in Matthew chapter 10. This is one of the times that he touches on it. He says that, be forewarned, brothers are going to betray brothers and are going to give them over to the sentence of death. And fathers will betray their own children, and children will betray their own parents, and they are going to give them over to death. Now, pause with me and think to yourself, what on earth would ever cause me to turn on my own family members like that? Jesus is predicting for his followers that there would come a time for some of them that they are going to have to choose. And in fact, they're going to watch the people that they love the most choose as well. And they're going to watch their family and their dear friends turn against them because of their faith. Really? I'm a father. I'm a husband. I have good friends. I have a brother. I have a sister. I have a father. I have a mother. What would ever make me turn them over to be prosecuted for their faith? I don't know. What on earth would ever make me turn on them the way that Jesus says people will turn on us because of our faith? I don't know. It's hard to imagine. I bet you're struggling too to imagine. What would ever have to happen within my family for me to respond like that? I don't know. Here's what I do know. This tells me that spiritual and moral differences are oftentimes the cause of great family chaos. They are combustible. They are volatile. And Jesus predicted that. Here's part of why. In every family, yours, mine, everyone, there is what's called a family system. There is a way that families just do things. And every person in the family just plays their part. You have the mother, who is the matriarch of the family, for instance, who is the caretaker to all. And it is assumed that whenever anyone is sick in the family, whenever anyone is down in the family, whenever anyone is going through a hard time in the family, everyone knows without even saying it, the person who's going to step up to care for that person or intervene for that person is mom. Because that's what mom always does. That's a family system. You have a brother who's never been able to make anything out of his life. And so he's in his mid-50s now, and he is still mooching off your parents. Well, guess what? That's a pattern of behavior that's probably been going on a long time. That's a family system. Here's what happens in family systems. If any one person changes their behavior or perspective, everybody else doesn't like it. And it can even be for the better. but nobody likes it. So, here's what Jesus is describing will happen for his followers. Somebody hears Jesus, encounters Jesus, and decides, what that guy is saying is worth my life. And I have now decided that I am going to commit myself to his teaching and to live it out among my friends and family. And all of a sudden, their family system and their little system that's in place among their friends changes. Because they used to get together with their friends and spend all kinds of money that they couldn't afford on things that really weren't needs. And when they sat around in the bar talking about other people, it never really was in a good way. It was very critical and sharp and demeaning. And now this person decides, I'm not going to play that way anymore. I can't do that. My Christian conscience won't let me do that. You know how their friends are going to respond? Not well. And all of a sudden, the target is no longer the people that they don't like in life outside of the circle of friends. The target becomes the Christian who decided to change their behavior. Why? Why is so-and-so doing that? What on earth has gone on in his life? Is he holier than thou? Do you think he's better than us? Oh, this will change. This is going to be a short-term thing. He'll get off this Jesus thing soon enough. Ever seen that happen in a family? I have seen people in Christian families make changes in their own behavior based on their own Christian conscience because they're trying to live out more fully what Jesus taught, and I have seen Christian families turn on that person. I have seen Christian families tell their brothers and sisters or their sons and daughters, I don't think you're saved. I think you're going to hell. Really? This is what happens sometimes among families because of Jesus. When Jesus gets into life, he changes us radically so. And he will do so over the rest of your lifetime. And it affects the people around you. It affects the people around you who are closest to you the most. And you need to know that sometimes as you begin to shape your own behavior in a more Jesus-like way, they are not going to respond well to that initially. I marvel, frankly, that some of the worst behavior that goes on among people, like family and friends, is because of spiritual and moral differences. What on earth would ever excuse the violence and aggression and anger of turning a family member over to the Roman authorities so they can be put to death because of Jesus? Wow. I do not get it. I do not get it. But Jesus says you need to expect this. As you change and his Spirit works in your life, it is going to affect the people around you. And they are not, at least initially, going to like it. And so they are going to react to you negatively. They're going to be aloof and distant. They're going to make you pay for it. And at that point, you're going to have to decide, how committed are you to this thing? Because there is no greater pain than losing people that you love. There is no greater pain than watching family members or friends walk away from you because you're just trying to follow Jesus. And it will happen to you at some point, sadly. And this is why we have each other. I imagine that there were disciples that day in Matthew chapter 10 who decided, wow, I thought I was on board with this whole Jesus thing. I am not so sure now. I don't know that I want to be called Satan himself. I don't know that I want to watch my family members and my dear friends walk away from me. And at that point, he or she could look to his right and his left and realize, oh, I'm not alone. Sometimes the best friends and family you'll have are your fellow disciples, who will grieve with you when you lose, who will hurt with you when you hurt, who will give you strength when you have none, and who will tell you that it's worth it. This is what Jesus said would happen to us as we go into the world. So here it is. The bulk of Matthew chapter 10, in which Jesus instructs his followers to go and do his work in the world, focuses on the resistance that they are going to experience. And here's what that resistance looks like. They are going to be resisted because they are going to challenge cherished, unquestioned values and priorities in their culture. And when they do it, their culture is not going to like it. They are going to challenge and question, just by their own choices to live a different way, some of those same behaviors and actions and attitudes in their own families, among their own good friends. And their family and good friends are not going to like it. By their mere presence in the world as light, they force the people around them to make choices about their own darkness. So are the words of Jesus in John chapter 3. I finish with this. We are told in the early annals of church history that 11 of the 12 disciples of Jesus saw Jesus' warnings in this chapter, Matthew chapter 10, fulfilled in the most dire way. That is, 11 of the 12 original disciples ended up being killed for their faith. For instance, doubting Thomas, who apparently got over his doubt, was killed with an arrow through the heart. Simon, the brother of Jude, was crucified in Egypt. Simon Peter, famous Simon Peter, was crucified upside down by his own request because he did not feel that he was worthy to be executed in the same exact manner as Jesus himself. Bartholomew, the disciple, was beaten with sticks, was crucified, and then was beheaded. They really wanted him dead. And James, the half-brother of Jesus, was stoned by a mob and ultimately killed by a crushing blow to his head. St. Jerome in 400 AD, 400 years after the life and times of Jesus, said that by his day, there was not a single day in the calendar year on which at least 5,000 Christians had not been killed for their faith. Here's the thing. You and I are never going to have to face that. You and I are never going to have to face deciding whether or not our physiological life is worth our faith or not. I don't think so. But in our own way, we will face what Jesus described today in Matthew chapter 10. And we will have to face what Martin Luther King Jr. famously said up there on the screen. A man who won't die for something, a man who is not willing to die for something, is really not fit to live. The death you will experience sometimes because of Jesus is going to be the loss of someone you care about. Maybe even a family member. Maybe the death you'll experience is not being understood by the people around you. You'll feel alienated and estranged because you just don't look at the world the way they do. You don't value things that they do. And you tend to value things that they overlook. That will be the death that you look at. That will be the death you have to choose. Are you willing for the people around you to think, his faith is too important to him? Her faith is too important to her. I can't trust her because in the end Jesus wins for her. I don't. This is the death you'll face. Are you fit to live? At some point, all of us will face this. And in that moment, I wonder what you'll do. Would you take a minute here at the end of the message? Up there on the screen are some prayer prompts about what we've talked about today. And as we think about being Jesus' disciples in the world, going and doing his mission, we need to listen to his warnings about what sometimes we will experience. Allow God to speak to you in the quiet for a moment or two about how you may have experienced this already, or whether or not you're even willing to. And after a moment or two, I'll pray for us all.